Welcome to Survey Booker Sessions. Tune in to hear from people working in a range of industries and roles to provide you ideas that you can take away and use in your own business. I'm your host, Matt Nally, the founder and director of Survey Booker, which is the leading CRM and survey management system for surveyors. On this week's episode, we have Sarah and Shane from Select Car Leasing. So thank you for both coming on.
Hiya.
Thank you. Hi.
Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself first and what your role is?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. So my name is Sarah Worthington. My role at Select Car Leasing is the corporate sales manager. So I head up our fleet division within Select. So dealing with corporates, SMEs, fleet customers who are looking for support on fleet management, fleet solutions for their fleet. And what comes under that as well is employee benefit schemes as well. So salary sacrifice schemes and also affinity schemes as well for wider employee benefits.
Awesome. That'll be interesting to hear a bit more
Mhm.
about later. Shane, what's your role?
Yeah, hi. I'm Shane Pither. I'm head of automotive innovation at Select Car Leasing. I've been here about 10 years, I guess now. Pretty much responsible for education within the business and effectively the EV expert for both partners and various customer journeys within the business.
Awesome. So I think today's going to be quite an interesting episode for me as well, because I've got probably my own misconceptions around electric vehicles and leasing and all that type of stuff, and realities versus myths. So we'll go through all that type of stuff. But I suppose to start with, the main topic for part one is going to be what are the realities of electric cars in the sort of 2020s. So I suppose as a starting point, do we go with what's the best way to navigate getting an electric car?
Yeah, it's quite an open question, Matt. It's a good question as well to ask. And a few years back, I'd probably say it's a bit more complicated than it is now. In reality, there's actually probably more choice than there's ever been, and it's only set to get better. There's more and more cars being released, pretty much, and updates going on pretty much on a weekly basis. So I don't think there's ever been a better time to navigate into an EV. And whether you're buying or leasing them, there's plenty of stock out there. So I think there's a lot more choice. It's not as bleak as it used to be, and it's going to get a lot better.
And is it I suppose with more choice, does that make it more complicated to know where to start, or does that help?
Again, it's a great question, actually, because I guess if you're new to it, there is a level of confusion. It's a different type of technology. And this is where we come in as experts. You know, customers picking up the phone to us, they're maybe not used to it. And again, part of my role within the business here is to help with that navigation there as well. So we try and make that as slick a process as possible. And it's really trying to understand what the customer's expecting and educating them to what is actually true. Because there's a lot of, as you say, a lot of misconceptions and a lot of myths out there that are not quite true anymore. So this is where we're best placed, I think, to advise, in my opinion.
That's an interesting point then. So I suppose if you're, let's say, looking for a car at the moment, or switching to something else, maybe it's because of age, end of another lease, whatever it might be. Where do you advise starting the process in terms of whether you decide to go with a normal combustion engine or type car, or whether you go down the electric route?
I think from a consumer point of view, you need to be really, really honest with yourself in how many miles you're actually doing. Because ultimately, if you're inquiring about an EV, there is a need or want to go that way, whether it's because of what you're seeing is happening in the media, whether you have green credentials or want to be better for the planet and the environment. The biggest thing that comes up is range anxiety. So I think if you're realistic to your expectations on what you're actually doing, not that I need to have 500 miles because that's what I've got in my combustion engine. Realistically, what are you doing? And it's normally 20 miles a day is most realistic for a lot of people. Maybe there's some longer journeys in between, and that's where your public charging comes into itself. And if you think that with the cars out there, on average, these cars are doing in excess of 200 miles, that's more than enough for most people to make that transition over. And so I think the key thing is to be realistic with what you're doing is in mileage.
Yeah, I think the mileage part's an interesting one for the surveying industry, because surveyors typically do a lot of driving in the day. Obviously, once they get to a job, they're not there looking around a property. But if they're out and about, they're going to different appointments. Sometimes it'll be one, sometimes it'll be multiple.
Yeah.
But they could all be fairly local. Some might be further afield. How difficult is it in reality with charging? Is it quite easy these days to find different ports, or are they all quite different in terms of which ones you can actually use? How complex is it really?
Exactly, and these are great questions, Matt, that you're asking here, because this is the level of confusion you get when people start looking at this. This big fear. It's not like a combustion engine where you can go and you can find a petrol station, you know where to look for, right?
Mm.
The reality is there is a lot more than you think. I think the latest data that was published by ZapMap, for example, was there are more connectors than there are petrol pumps in the UK. So that's great.
Okay.
They're just not in your normal conventional locations. Regards to the charging, somebody that's on the road will be using public charging, rapid chargers out there. And these things typically do 10 to 80%, 20, 30, 40 minutes, depending on, where you read this and what the conditions of the car and the temperatures outside are like. So you're being realistic. That's probably a stop off for most people who just pulled into a service station, for example. They've had a comfort break, grabbed a quick cup of coffee, and they're back on their way. The way of planning that is, unlike a combustion engine whereby you're wanting to fill it to maximum, you just top it up just enough to get you home. The key to do this is that you charge it when it's more convenient to yourself, and that's usually when you sleep. I always like to refer this back to your simple mobile phone. You charge these when you sleep or when you're at home doing other things. It's the same thing. You wouldn't stand there and wait for it to charge up. You charge it overnight, wake up with a full charge in the morning. It's pretty much what you do with an EV with home charging. If you run out of charge on that phone during the daytime, you would actually charge it up. You'd find a charger somewhere, you charge it just enough to make the rest of the calls for the rest of the day and get home and charge it. Same with the public charging. Charge it just enough to get you back home, plug it in overnight, wake up in the morning with a full charge. So you've got less downtime there, and it's normally just a comfort break and off you go again.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. I suppose the only other question that in my mind that comes after that is, if you are over optimistic with your range on one day, like we've seen people run out of petrol before, is it really complicated at that point to deal with? I suppose the obvious one is you get towed to a charging point and you top up, whereas a petrol vehicle, you might just try and get someone to run you down to a petrol station, chuck in the 5 litres and off you go. But is it still quite simple to deal with at that point, or does it happen that often?
I think what you've discussed there is a genuine fear. Somebody who's not had an EV before, and that comes up as another question that comes up quite readily as well. You're right, it's not like a normal combustion engine. If it runs out of fuel, you can't just run down the road and get a jerry can. It just doesn't work that way. Yeah. In reality, people with EVs are a lot more planned. And by that, I mean, you've seen it many times before. I'm sure there's someone with a petrol engine who's got a petrol gauge on there, but yet they've still broken down. They've run out of fuel. They've misjudged it, or they've misfueled or whatever. With an EV, I think the stats that came back with the RAC or the breakdown recoveries or the AA was most of these breakdowns that do happen, if they happen in EV, tend to happen at charge points whereby they're not operating. So they've already planned that journey. And that's only set to get better because public charging is getting better all the time. That was a few years back. So I think in reality, it's not something that generally happens. You've also got a bit of leeway on these cars as well. They go into what they call a turtle mode right towards the end, and there's always a little bit more, a bit like the tank in your car, to get you there, because they're expecting this to happen. Yeah. But in reality, you hear very few cases of it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I've seen an electric car stuck at the edge of the road before. So
this is my point.
It's a fear-driven question, yeah.
Of course, but it's a good question.
Are there other misconceptions you see around the realities of driving? We'll come on to other ones around sort of whether they're environmental or not, and those types of sort of misconceptions. But are there other fears you see people raising around that?
I think it's like any type of new technology. It's just understanding it slightly differently, isn't it? I mean, one of the things I was saying just now about is when you charge, it's not like you charge it up fully. The other bits and pieces where I guess is people's expectation levels to avoid disappointment. You hear about ranges that are quoted that maybe people don't get. That's no different to an MPG from a car manufacturer currently. Yeah. But because it's an EV, people hang on to that. And it's a difficult one. So as long as people are realistic with this, the fact that these are on rolling road figures, and that there's certain things that can affect that outside of that control, and that could be temperatures outside, what auxiliary functions you've got on, whether you're doing a lot of motorway rather than town driving, so you're not getting so much regenerative braking back. Yeah. I guess if you're more realistic about that and you understand that, you can make and plan those journeys effectively. And a great way of doing that is with one of our other partners on ZapMap, where you can have a look at that platform. You can pre-plan that, so you can understand where you might need to stop. making that whole process a lot smoother.
It's an interesting point, because I chuckle slightly there, because I was thinking back to the miles per gallon on a car, and it's the same. Yeah. I've done this before. I want the miles per gallon, but I also want to have a bit of fun sometimes. And going down the motorway and going, why am I not getting the mileage out of it?
Heavy right foot.
Yeah, exactly that. I suppose then the other aspects that come up a lot. I suppose the argument around this is different publications will come out because different people are backing them, and they've all got different motives, whether they're the EV producers or whether they're the oil and gas companies. But you hear mixed information around how green cars are, and obviously there's a complex aspect around where does the energy come from? Is it coal powered? Is it renewable? That type of stuff. So that's I suppose more of a running cost, perhaps, or running factor. But yeah, how environmentally friendly are they versus in terms of like total life, I guess, versus a petrol?
It's an interesting one. It comes up time and time again, because obviously everything's got a cost to the environment to make. In other words, carbon footprint. Right, we're hearing more and more about this as we're moving to net zero in the UK and other places throughout Europe. So it's an interesting one. Generally speaking, EVs are less of a footprint than a combustion engine, and that was been publicised on MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, recently, where you can actually see this. I think that's one aspect of it, which is fact. The other aspect of it that I think people forget quite a bit is that these EVs don't have a tailpipe, so there is less emissions affecting the environment and people's health via air. So there is two sides to this argument, really, about moving to EV. Yes, there is an impact on the environment. There is with anything you make, but it's a lot less than combustion engines. The bonus is you're also getting less impact to the environment via the emissions. So I still think it's a good thing to be happening.
Perfect. And I've got, I think, two other questions around myths and myths and truths, if you don't mind. One is, so are they dangerous? I suppose one of the things you keep seeing in the news, and this is nothing to do with electric cars, but you see the same thing, like a house has gone up in flames because of an electric bike, and it tends to be the smaller mass-produced stuff. Is that risk? Is that risk there, whether when Tesla going a light, or I don't know, short circuiting or something like that, or are they built very differently to something like an electric bike?
Yeah, I mean, you've seen things on the news, I'm sure. It's because it's an EV, it tends to get highlighted. And unfortunately, the first thing you hear when it's an EV, people go, it's got to be a Tesla. It's not always the case, by the way. It's just that they're a very well-known brand. So I feel sorry for them in a little way. But you heard about it recently at Luton. I'm sure you saw that in the car park with that car called Fire. We went, it's got to be an EV. It wasn't an EV. It was a combustion engine as it happened. But yeah, when this happens with combustion engines, you hear very little of it. But generally speaking, these EVs are constructed really well. Yeah, they're housed in there. The other misconceptions, you think that you're going to electrocute yourself if you go through a stream or something with a bit of water. It's not the case. They're well housed inside there to protect you. So I think, whilst it does happen, I'm not going to deny it does. It's probably not as much as you think it does, and certainly no more than combustion engines, I would say.
Yeah, and that's, I suppose, an important comparison to make, because it's relative to a combustion engine. They're not perfect either, and there will be an element of both doing the same thing.
Of course.
But my last question, I think, is around batteries, and I think two parts on this one. One is the question around, can they be recycled? Because you hear sort of people saying they can, they can't. And the other one is, does it affect the value of the car? As in, like, if you take a petrol car, for example, I appreciate I'm asking you two questions in one go here. But if you take a petrol, it could last 20 to 25 years in terms of, before the engine gives up and valves go wrong, whatever it might be.
Yep.
With an EV, do the batteries last that long? Or are there big costs to potentially replace them? Do we know yet? I think that's my final sort of myth and truth kind of element.
Sure. I mean, and again, because we can relate this to a mobile phone and we know those lose charge over time, we've all seen this happen, right? Some of that might be software related. You've probably heard in the news as well. Some of it could be hardware related. I won't go any further into that. But ultimately, I guess a few years back, manufacturers, when they start making these cars, weren't too sure. They had a lot of alerts, well, not alerts, but a lot of advice not to rapid charge too often to 100%. and it wasn't good for the battery. So it happens it surprised them actually. They've come back and the loss to charge on these batteries is a lot less than they thought it was going to be. That's why you're starting to see manufacturers giving 8-year warranties on their batteries. This is a good sign, right, of what they're doing in the day. And you're also seeing second, third, fourth, and even fifth lives on these batteries. And by that I mean that used car market potentially as a secondary car, it's more than enough mileage to get you to and from as a second vehicle, as local driving. Deconstruction of these vehicles, recycling, they're using some of the battery power left over to make it environmentally friendly, to break that product down again. It's good for the environment. Some of the other aspects. And you're also seeing them in battery storage, solar and battery, which is a good point to take on as well. So being strapped to people's walls, because it's still going to be holding enough charge to be able to do that job.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot more life to this, not just in the car, but outside that, as I say, second, third, fourth, and fifth lives.
Interesting. I imagine they get to a point where they can work out ways of switching batteries over. If it's 12 years old and it needs a different battery pack, they'll have come up with something. I would have thought by then anyway, but
we're starting to see it with Neo that's coming in from Europe, where they've got battery dropouts. They've started doing it in various parts of Europe, where you drive in, battery comes out, slots back in again. It's another solution to that problem. It's great in some areas, not others. Probably wouldn't work so well in London when you're trying to get across in the traffic. But it's a good, all these sort of things help with this solution to what's going on with the drive to going full electric in the UK and the world.
Perfect. And then my final question then on this topic, it's just on that recycling part. You hear misconceptions around the fact that they can't and they get dumped somewhere. Is that reality, or actually are we getting quite good at recycling batteries and repurposing and reusing?
Probably not happening as much as it was thought to be happening, as I said previously, and in the fact that because it's got second and third life and they're lasting longer than they expected initially. But more importantly, they have a responsibility. Whoever produces these batteries, the manufacturers are taking this on, by the way, with government mandate to recycle these. They've got a level of responsibility. It's been put back onto them. So you're starting to see manufacturers partnering up with recycling companies ready for this if it needs to happen. So they have an obligation. So yes, the answer is these will be recycled. They have to recycle them.
So it's really interesting to hear that, because the discussion I've had a few times around other aspects of the economy are the fact that we don't take into account environmental carbon factors in production and at the end of a life cycle, single life plastics and stuff like that. It's not built into the price of being dealt with. So councils have to handle that problem when stuff gets thrown out and so on. Yeah. So no, it's really interesting to hear that's been built in.